So this week, I have really just sort of a lot of thought fragments, and they're not so much about community as they are in the ways that I see communication changing. And a lot of them are thoughts I've had for a long time, but I just haven't made these connections before. About 20 years ago, I had a student who, I want to say part of what she was studying in college was nutrition. She may have been a nutrition minor. And she was on the speech and debate team that I was coaching at the time, and I remember there being a conversation on a long van trip. We would have to drive long distances to competition because we could only afford to fly once or twice a year. And what she said, I'm sure I'm oversimplifying because I translated it into what I could understand, which was not the tech-heavy explanation. And this is also very old memory, so I know that I am leaving details of this out. But she said that a good thing to do if you wanted to be healthier was whenever you ate anything made from grain, what you should pick is you should pick what was less processed. That whole grain was better than things that were ground up and bleached and so forth. And the way she explained it was, you eat grocery store white bread and it goes off inside your body like a sugar hand grenade. Your body is able to process that so quickly. And a little later I got curious and I did some searches and read up on glycemic load. And you do that to your body over and over and over again, and a whole lot of unhealthy things happen. And it may be one of the things that is a risk factor for type 1 diabetes. Definitely it's not good if you are struggling with weight. So one of the little things would be a lot of people, if they've been brought up on a diet of a lot of processed grain, then they may not like foods that are whole grain. They may find them coarse. They may say that they taste, I've heard it said that they taste like sawdust. But if you can sort of habituate yourself to where those things taste familiar and you really don't have a problem with them, that's a little almost passive thing you can do. Just at the point of choice, choose one food over another where they're almost interchangeable if your taste doesn't get in the way. And over time, you're detonating fewer of those sugar grenades inside your body. Now again, I assume that's very unscientific. I assume that I am exaggerating, playing up and downplaying things inappropriately, but that's my memory of that conversation, and I actually have tried to make that change. And I'm reasonably happy with my health and with my dietary choices, but that is part... I'm not going to be able to remember the names of any of the books that I've read about this or documentaries I've seen over the years, but what the food industry in the United States has done is it's taken some of the flavors that we respond to, so the mouthfeel of fat and the taste of sweet and the taste of salt, and it's continued to manipulate and balance them. And these are things that we respond to out of almost primal needs. They signal us that certain of our needs are being met. And so, junk food, it's a very, very profitable industry to continue to fine-tune junk food to where people almost can't stop eating it, to where the craving, once you experience the sweet and the salt and the mouthfeel of fat, you'll be driven the way someone dying of thirst would be driven to cool, clear water. And the thing is, at some point, if you can exercise discipline over yourself and if you can take a couple of steps back, and if you eat things that are not quite as exaggerated, eat things that are not quite as played up, you can get to a point where those highly, highly manipulated forms of junk food seem almost gross. I remember the first time I was someplace at a restaurant that had a dessert called Death by Chocolate, and at the time I thought, wow, that sounds pretty neat, and I gave it a try, and I thought that was pretty neat. Right now, if anyone were to offer me any of the Death by Chocolates that I've seen over the years, it would just be disgusting. It would be like, taking cotton candy and putting whipped cream on top of it. And that may sound good to some people out there, but to me it just sounds like, whoa, sugar overload, getting slapped in the face with sugar. And that image, that people are taking what you respond to with pleasure, and people are using the fact that you have that pleasure response almost built into you. And it's something that can be manipulated to bring you back over and over again with motivation that never quite goes away to spend your money. And they can extract your money from you with skillful use of those drives. I think that is the curve that we have been on in public talk, in public messages, in how we communicate. And I think it's true in a number of ways. I think it's true in how films are made. And I have to say, in putting these notes down, I have felt so absurdly old. I have felt so much like a curmudgeon who's grumbling about kids today. But it really does seem the case when I got this impression most sharply, and I think I've talked about this before, when I went and saw the J.J. Abrams Star Trek several years ago, and every single scene in the movie had to be a chase. Every single scene had to have me sitting on the edge of my seat, and I only got about 2/3 of the way through it when I just sat back and said, okay, enough of this. This is just poorly made. If the only way you can tell a story is for the entire movie to be at a fever pitch from the first moment until the last moment, then this is just not good storytelling. This is really just trying to give me an adrenaline surge from the start of the film to the end. And I mean, the whole thing can't be a peak. If the whole thing is a peak experience, how in the world, how do you build? You build so much, or I don't know, you do so much shocking of people's ability to be excited that at some point they've got to get exhausted and they've got to get burned out. And I look around and all these people are sitting on the edge of their seats. And apparently you have to give them this much of a charge. You have to give them this much voltage because they have become so jaded and their aesthetics have become so calloused that it has to stay at that pitch the entire time or they will cease to be fully engaged in it. And I think about people carrying around their digital devices, and they have to have this steady diet of clickbait. And to go back to talking about Sherry Turkle and her warnings, she talks about solitude, about how it's important for you to experience, for all of us to experience, being in situations, having moments where we have no input coming in, where we are alone with ourselves. And when you have a rich self, and you can sit and you can reflect, you can sit and you can work through some of your recent experiences without outside stimulus. You can compare what you've observed and what you've been doing, what you've been active in, to your own goals and your own values, and that can be meaningful work in itself. And you don't suffer anxiety that you're not plugged in, and you don't tell yourself you're bored because there is no sensation going on in your life. It's important that we have the ability to profit from solitude. That is the foundation of our ability to be social. So, you have a lot of death by chocolate, or you have a lot of fast food French fries. And where do you wind up? You wind up obese. And you have a lot of these films, or you have a lot of this music, or you have a lot of this digital content coming in on your device, and you wind up overloaded. You wind up needing more and more deviance to find something interesting. You wind up needing a steady diet of people doing things that are wrong, people committing shocking crimes, so that you can have that satisfying moment of hating them. And, I go back to I forget how many minutes it was in 1984, but I think the 3-minute hate. And we have been on a jag of 3-minute hate. Read the news, see the latest person who did something shocking to their kids, see the latest news of someone who mistreated their pets, and have your little moment of hating. And it's socially acceptable hate. It's not hate that's about race or about wealth or anything like that. It's this awful person who did this awful thing, written up in a news story, probably with all the complexity completely edited out of it, because if you have an opportunity to engage in a very satisfying exercise of hatred with no complexity and with no ambiguity involved, then that'll draw your eyes to that story and someone will profit from you. It is the playing up the sweet and the salt and the mouthfeel of fat, but it's doing it with a release of your anxiety and your turmoil in the form of identifying a scapegoat and hating. And of course, anytime we talk about any issue of public concern, what do? We play up the conflict. We identify with our teams. Our teams are now in competition. It might as well be the playoffs for the Super Bowl. And it really is just a matter of, is our team going to outplay their team? And the score consists of elections and bills passed, and nobody pays the slightest bit of attention to the phenomenon that the bill is supposed to address. So, as I record this, we are still in the middle of seeing whether the Republicans in Congress are going to be able to pass their repeal of the Affordable Care Act. And it's just absolutely striking that nobody will take the bill that is currently before the legislature. Nobody will compare it to the nature of the problem. What is the problem with health care in America? What do we have to do to make our healthcare system work more rationally to where people can get good healthcare, people can afford to get healthcare, people are not discouraged from seeking preventive care? What do we have to do to catch up with the rest of the world? Nobody's talking about that. Instead, Senator McConnell is on record as saying with this bill, his objective, it's not lower healthcare costs, it's not increased coverage, it's 51 votes. If the bill is passed, then they've closed the loop on a promise they started making about 5-6 years ago, which was they would repeal Obamacare. The objective? Repeal Obamacare. That's the one accomplishment that is squarely in front of them, and that's the one thing that's blocking their ability to get onto anything else on their agenda. And I sound like I'm trashing the Republicans. The Democrats are equally likely to be guilty of this. And it, I think, is of a piece with tuning storytelling to where we sit on the edge of our seats the entire time, tuning online content to where our curiosity is just kept at the peak all the time, tuning music to where a few musical elements that bring on a response of excitement or a response of momentary pleasure, they are remixed and recombined and auto-tuned. And I don't think it's an accident that just about all the movies that get made these days are sequels. It seems as if it doesn't serve anybody's purpose, it doesn't fit within the market as people see it today to tell a new story. Why would you want to tell a new story? The objective of movie storytelling is to manipulate you through certain very precisely planned emotions, because that's what it takes to get you interested and keep you interested. And what's the best way to do that? Create a universe, create a franchise, and make sequel after sequel after sequel. It's like traveling around the world to a bunch of different countries and always taking your meals at McDonald's, because no matter where you go in the world, you know the McDonald's is going to have pretty much the same thing. And you can get your Big Mac, and you can get your fast food fries with a lot of salt and with, I think they do actually involve sugar. I think that's how they caramelize the fries. Maybe I'm making that up. Definitely with the mouthfeel of fat, though. I think it's no longer beef fat. I think they've changed that to where they are reasonably vegetarian now. I don't know that those details matter at all. So, the last thought I had in thinking about all of this in the changing nature of messages, I got to thinking about Gutenberg and the printing press. And what the printing press did, it had a lot of unexpected effects. It laid the groundwork for the industrial age, because one of the first things you could mass produce is you could mass produce literature. And then later on, we learned in factories that you could mass produce a lot of other things. But Gutenberg also standardized, the printing press standardized spelling. Before there was such a thing as the movable type press, spelling was a matter of a lot of individual variation, and a lot of people had their own spellings. Of the seven signatures we have of William Shakespeare, if I'm not mistaken, I've read this a couple of places, he spelled his own name a different way just about every time, depending on the mood he was in. It makes me think, to go back to my food analogy, that most of the beloved family dishes that get handed down from generation to generation, people throw in however much of whatever ingredient they've got. They do it on the spur of the moment. They do it based on what they see in front of them and how they're feeling that day, and they make variations based on the last time, and those recipes change. But if you're going to hand that recipe down to your kids, you got to write it down. And then that recipe, at least in that form, is standardized. Well, the same thing happened with spelling when the works that were being circulated, the works that were being published, when a lot of people could have them, and because they were popped out of the press, the spelling was identical in all of them. There was no copying. Copyists were not involved at all. Then it's almost like the light bulb went on and we realized this is how written language is supposed to be. The words are supposed to have the same spelling every time. Now, nobody thinks that when you have conversations with other people, you can add your own inflection to it. You can have your own speaking style. You speak with your own accent. There's lots of variation. People even mispronounce words a little bit, or people fail to enunciate, and you do a lot of deciphering and decoding. And back when people were a little more idiosyncratic with their spelling, I imagine that when you read, you did a lot more deciphering and decoding. But what the printing press did is it put an end to a lot of that. And the concept that there was correct spelling and anything that deviated from that was incorrect spelling, that took root. And today it's one of those things that we just accept as a given. It's almost unexamined. Even though linguists would say the idea that there is correct language and there is incorrect language has a big old problem at the heart of it. Language is basically what people use and what people understand. And it is the case that you can make a good or bad impression on another person if they believe you are using language correctly. If they think you're using it incorrectly, you'll probably make a bad impression, an impression that you're not careful, that you're not very professional. But the idea that there is some independently observable, objective quality to language, that it's correct or incorrect, that's just absolutely a myth. Now, that whole idea that I just talked out, that's old hat. That I've known about for a very long time, and I think that idea is fairly widely known. But what I think is happening today is, I think in the age of the internet, and I think the fact that you can Google solutions for so many problems. I hear IT people say that they're not really wizards with computers. They just hear you describe the problem you're having and then they Google it, and right there is the solution to it because someone else has had the same problem. The other day, I was listening to a sermon preached by a pastor that I think fairly highly of down in Texas, and he was talking about how important it is for married couples that from time to time they have romantic evenings together. And he had some advice to give the wives in his congregation, but then he said to the husbands, now, if you're like a lot of guys, you have no idea how to come up with a romantic evening with your wife. That's why Google exists. So in other words, just type in romantic evening, date with wife, something like that, and then see what other people did and copy that. And it seems to me that what the internet is doing, it's doing to our narratives, it's doing to our ideas what Gutenberg and the movable type did to spelling. It is smoothing out the differences. It is evening out the differences in what everyone knows. And this is something that I've seen a lot of people point out. Before we had the internet, you could actually sit and argue over things like what baseball player playing shortstop had the best stats in the history of the game. Well, nobody would argue about that today because you get out your phone and you check. You have something on you that lets you settle all such disputes. And a lot of urban legends get debunked. They're not circulated, modified. They don't become part of folk wisdom anymore. Debunking is kind of a simple thing. And then, obviously, I got to thinking about, well, if that's the case, if that's the direction things are going, then why is it that we have such a problem with fake news? Why is it that we have such a problem of people being so polarized that people will not accept facts? People disagree over what facts are. Why do we have controversy over whether parents ought to vaccinate their children, if that's the effect that the internet ought to have? And then my mind went in a not very nice, slightly gruesome direction, because I got to thinking about the Kennedy assassination. And I have a very straightforward, confident position on the Kennedy assassination. I won't even call it a belief because I'm that sure of it. Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, killed John F. Kennedy, and that's all there is to it. And really, you can use all the controversy and all the theories surrounding that event as a case study, as an environment to study how reasoning can get distorted and twisted and turn pathological. And one of the things that people who are new to that set of conspiracy theories, one of the things they're very likely to stumble on is when you look at the Zapruder film and you see the assassination happening and you see it looks like his head, Kennedy's head, really does snap back, as though it had to be a shooter in front of him and the bullet hitting him, the force of the bullet had to knock his head back. Well, there are lots of reasons that that is simply not true, and it's perfectly consistent that he could be shot from behind and his head still snap back. One explanation is the neuromuscular spasm, that the bullet went into his brain and therefore a lot of muscles, a lot of nerves fired and made muscles contract, and there's a real simple anatomical explanation for why that would jerk him back. The other is, and this is really gruesome, so if you're eating something you might not want to, or you might want to pause this. The other explanation is the jet effect, that what the bullet did when it came into the back of his head is it blew out the entire front of his head, and all of that matter being thrown out the front of his head, you know, Newton said this is what would happen. It pushed his head back because it was the equal and opposite reaction of all of that matter being thrown off. The point is, I think what happened, or what we are in the middle of seeing happening, with widespread access to the internet and with people getting habituated with enough information having been stored and all being available, that it's now just sort of an everyday life skill to look up what other people think on simple topics and just imitate that. You would think we would move toward consensus. You would think we would become more homogeneous in what we think about and in what we think. And yet, I think there is a neuromuscular spasm happening. I think there's something that's pushing us in a surprising and opposite direction. I think that when you find yourself in the middle of the ocean, when you find yourself in the middle of an undifferentiated mass where you have nothing to put your feet on, I think that you grab on to whatever flotsam and jetsam you find in the water. And so, this is an idea that I think I've talked to death on this podcast, but I think that that is what's driving a lot of people to band together so tightly and for loyalty to move so far above accuracy in the set of priorities in filtering information and messages that come in, to where the content really doesn't do any work and the relational dimension of the message really is everything. So, in part, I think I am being very curmudgeonly here, because here I am saying, oh, this music today, it's all throwaway. None of it's ever going to be a classic. But I mean, I kind of do think that. I think of songs, I know it's been several years since Call Me Maybe came out, but songs like that are not aging well, and I'm not sure anybody is going to call that song a classic. And I really am struck by the fact that a lot of the very successful musical acts from the 60s are still around and have become nostalgia acts. And back in the 60s, the 50s and 60s, people just took it as a given. They just absolutely, they thought it was beyond obvious that you can only do something like play in a rock and roll band from the time you're maybe 22 to 25, and then you age out and you go and you get a real job, and nobody can imagine that continuing to happen once people become adults. And if I'm not careful, I'm going to spin this off in a completely separate direction, and I'm going to get to talking about youth and adulthood again, which I've had that talk and I have nothing really to add to that. But, I mean, I think it does seem as though the nostalgia acts of the 60s do not have the heft and the durability of the standards from earlier in the 20th century, and those don't have the time testing of what we regard as classical music from even earlier centuries. those, it seems, what survives has a kind of beauty that does not remind me of store-bought white bread. There are layers to it. And if you listen to it a zillion times and a zillion and one times, you'll continue to find new things. You'll continue to find that it evokes in you something that's powerful. And so it's almost like going for the whole grain of experience instead of the highly processed experience that's what's being sold today, that is all about elicit the response from you so that we can make money off you. And I said that was going to be fragmentary, and it definitely doesn't add up to anything just yet, but the whole point of this has always been to talk my thoughts out and see if they become any more clear in the talking. And I don't know what to say as far as whether that became any clearer, but we'll see about it next week.